Right now, something huge is going down in the Caribbean Sea. The United States is sending more military power to this area than we've seen at any point in the last 20 years. Actually, it's the biggest show of American force in the Western Hemisphere since the Panama invasion back in 1989. This time, though, the military isn't even hiding its focus. They're moving right up to the edge of Venezuela, probably the one country in the Americas that pushes back hardest against the US. Everyone's asking the same thing. Are we really staring down the barrel of a new war? And if we are, what would that even look like? I'm Emma Chamberlain, and today on SmartScope, we're diving headfirst into one of the world's most tense standoffs. We're going to dig into the US military buildup off Venezuela's coast, the jaw-dropping $50 million bounty for President Nicolas Maduro, the messy history between the US and Venezuela, and what might actually come next. Honestly, this isn't just a story about military hardware or politics. It's about oil, sanctions, desperate migrants, and old-school gunboat diplomacy making a messy comeback. It's the story of how the country with the world's largest oil reserves fell apart, and why that chaos now risks dragging the United States into a fight that, frankly, nobody seems to want, yet both sides seem unable to back away from. So, let's start with the military presence, because it's almost hard to believe. The U.S. has anchored 3 state-of-the-art Arleigh Burke-class destroyers and a Ticonderoga-class cruiser off Venezuela's shoreline, plus a nuclear attack submarine lurking nearby. Altogether, these ships are loaded with dozens, possibly hundreds, of Tomahawk cruise missiles. Just to give you an idea, each Tomahawk flies more than 1,000 miles, hits with pinpoint accuracy, and can deliver a warhead big enough to flatten just about anything. And one ship can carry around 90 of them. With what's parked outside Venezuela right now, the U.S. could basically wipe out the entire Venezuelan military's infrastructure overnight. And ships aren't the only thing out there. The 22nd Marine Expeditionary Unit has moved in, led by the USS Iwo Jima. If you've never seen one, the Iwo Jima is basically an aircraft carrier shrunk down, with Harrier jump jets, Osprey helicopters, Sikorsky choppers, and hovercraft, all loaded for beach assaults. Over 2,500 elite Marines are deployed there, backed by 2,000 Navy sailors. These troops are trained for high-speed, high-risk missions. If the U.S. needs to act fast, these are the people who do it. And just to top things off, the U.S. has added a littoral combat ship to the mix, bringing the naval count up to 9 vessels. They've also sent at least 10 F-35 stealth fighters to Puerto Rico. These jets are pretty much invisible to radar and can cover the distance to Caracas in under an hour. The firepower is honestly staggering. Now, the Trump administration says this show of force is really about cracking down on drug trafficking, cutting off the narcotics flowing out of Venezuela. But let's get real for a second. Nobody really believes speedboats and old cargo planes need to be stopped by cruise missiles, Harriers, F-35s, and thousands of Marines. It's like bringing a tank to chase down a pickpocket. Most drugs coming into the U.S. don't even pass through Venezuela's coastline. A lot comes in through the Pacific, and even flights do an end run around this whole armada. So, yeah, people are talking. Maybe this is really about pushing for regime change in Venezuela. And there's more. Even before these ships began to gather, the U.S. government doubled the bounty on President Nicolas Maduro, from $25 million to a record $50 million. Think about that. $50 million, the biggest bounty the U.S. has ever slapped on one person. For context, that's twice the price they put on Osama bin Laden, Saddam Hussein, or ISIS's old leader. Each of them topped out at $25 million. The U.S. doesn't even recognize Maduro as Venezuela's leader anymore. So, just for a second, let that sink in. America is offering twice as much money for the capture of Nicolas Maduro as it ever did for the guy behind the September 11th attacks. That's where we are, a massive military force pointing straight at Venezuela, a bounty that sends a message, and a lot of uncertainty about what happens next. Maduro isn't the only big name in Venezuela carrying a hefty price on his head from the U.S. His Minister of the Interior, Diosdado Cabello, is now worth $25 million to anyone who will turn him in. Defense Minister General Vladimir Padrino Lopez goes for $15 million. Then there's the Minister of Industry, Tarek Zaidan El Aissami, with a $10 million tag. Altogether, just 4 of Maduro's top people add up to $100 million in bounties, a staggering sum, and honestly, that kind of money has to make folks in Maduro's circle a little nervous about who they trust. This summer, President Trump signed off on a secret order. It let the U.S. military use force against Latin American drug cartels the government calls terrorist organizations, including Venezuela's notorious Tren de Aragua. The move drags up the old Monroe Doctrine from 1823. Back then, the U.S. announced to Europe that the Americas were off limits for colonization, and that any move in this direction would mean trouble. For decades, Washington used that idea to justify meddling or outright intervention in Latin America. Now it's showing up again, dusted off for the 21st century. Trump and his team say Maduro and his circle run a drug cartel called the Cartel of the Suns, quietly backing Tren de Aragua and Mexico's Sinaloa cartel, sending cocaine and fentanyl into the U.S. They've officially labeled the Cartel of the Suns a terrorist organization. That's how they explain the sky-high bounties, and it could double as a pretext for military action against Maduro. Is this cartel real? That's hotly debated. Countries like Argentina, Paraguay, Peru, Ecuador, and the Dominican Republic have followed the U.S. lead, calling it a terrorist group. Maduro says it's a fantasy, and Colombia's left-wing president says the whole story is just a smokescreen to overthrow Venezuela's government. Even inside the U.S., intelligence reports aren't unanimous. A declassified National Intelligence Council report from May flat out says Maduro's government likely doesn't work with Tren de Aragua. And Mexico doesn't buy it either. They say they haven't found any links between Maduro and the Sinaloa cartel. So the supposed main reason for possible military action doesn't actually line up, even among U.S. officials. Despite the confusion and debate, everything's set. The U.S. made its first move on September 2nd when a boat carrying 11 Venezuelans in international waters was hit by a missile, probably fired from an American MQ-9 Reaper drone. Everyone died. Washington insists the vessel smuggled drugs and that those aboard were with Tren de Aragua, but whatever the truth, this is a new level. The usual approach is to intercept and board suspected smuggling boats, not blow them up from afar. Using a drone strike like this feels like a message. The rules have changed. CNN says insiders in the Trump administration are seriously considering wider military strikes on cartel targets inside Venezuela. That could mean hitting Tren de Aragua, or even Venezuelan government sites, since Washington claims there's no real difference between the two. Maduro, for his part, is not taking this lightly. He's on edge, ordering full military mobilization, calling on citizens to join armed militias, sending troops toward Colombia, and promising to fight to the end. On September 5th, Venezuelan F-16s buzzed close to U.S. warships, and the Americans threatened to shoot them down next time. At this point, it's fair to say the U.S. and Venezuela are closer to war than ever. You need to know the background to make sense of how things got this tense. Venezuela should be an energy giant. It holds the world's largest proven oil reserves. Back in the 1970s, it used to be the richest country in Latin America, by GDP per capita. But the country's oil is tricky. It's heavy, thick, and expensive to refine. To handle that, Venezuela worked with oil giants like Exxon, Chevron, ConocoPhillips, and Shell, letting them set up joint ventures with the state oil company, PDVSA. Oil profits were split 60-40, with PDVSA benefiting from foreign expertise. By the late 1990s, 60 to 70% of Venezuela's oil exports went straight to the U.S., making up about 15% of all American imports, a bigger share than any other country at the time. Massive oil wealth was supposed to be a blessing, but it brought chaos, runaway corruption, mismanagement, and a country hooked on oil money. Between 1972 and 1997, officials stole about $100 billion. Oil ended up dominating everything: 90% of exports, 70% of the government's budget, and nearly 40% of GDP, which left other industries out in the cold. When oil prices crashed in the 80s, Venezuela got slammed by inflation and debt. In 1989, desperate for help, the government turned to the IMF. Their bailout deal came with harsh austerity measures, and the country erupted. Deadly riots followed. People were angry. Hugo Chavez, riding this storm of discontent, tried a coup in 1992. He failed, landed in jail, but came back to win the 1998 presidential election. He promised to share the oil wealth, and at first, poverty rates dropped. But his policies set Venezuela up for disaster. Oil production peaked in the early 2000s, but when workers at PDVSA went on strike in 2002, Chavez fired thousands of skilled employees. The industry lost experienced hands overnight. He nationalized the oil sector, seized foreign assets, and soured relations with the U.S., making investment dry up. On top, he shipped subsidized oil to allies like Cuba and Nicaragua, bleeding the reserves. By 2013, national debt had soared and reserves ran low. The system just couldn't keep running. But Chavez kept grabbing more power, pushing towards dictatorship. When Chavez died in 2013, Nicolas Maduro, his vice president, took over and locked Venezuela into a full-blown dictatorship. In 2014, global oil prices tanked again. The economy spiraled. Welfare programs worked only when the oil cash rolled in. Now that money was gone. Protests exploded, and Maduro struck back with violence. In 2015, Obama labeled Venezuela a national security threat and slapped on targeted sanctions. Things got worse under Trump, when the U.S. unleashed a wave of new sanctions. The 2018 election was a mess, filled with irregularities and opposition boycotts. The U.S. refused to recognize Maduro's win, and instead backed opposition leader Juan Guaido as interim president. Diplomatic ties were severed, new sanctions rolled out, and Venezuela lost access to the U.S. financial system. American companies couldn't buy Venezuelan oil anymore. Even transporting their oil became impossible. Gulf Coast refineries were cut off, spare parts and chemicals blocked. With skilled workers leaving and constant mismanagement, oil production collapsed. By 2021, Venezuela's economy had shrunk by 3/4, one of the worst collapses any country had seen in modern times. Hyperinflation hit 130,000% in 2018. Basic goods disappeared, and by 2022, more than half the country lived in poverty. Sanctions were meant to topple Maduro and restore democracy, but they backfired. Instead, millions of Venezuelans fled the country, sparking a migration crisis. Nearly 8 million ended up leaving, with growing numbers arriving at the U.S. southern border. By 2021, Venezuelans were the second biggest nationality crossing the border. By 2023, their numbers in the U.S. had jumped nearly tenfold since 2019. Maduro stayed in power, crushed protests, and leaned hard on allies like Cuba, Russia, China, and Iran, turning Venezuela into another Cuba. Cuban intelligence kept him secure. Russia and Iran supplied weapons, and China bought most of the oil Venezuela managed to export. Biden tried a new path, easing some sanctions in exchange for political guarantees. In late 2023, Chevron got the green light to restart some operations, and Venezuela got a 6-month license to export oil if Maduro promised a free and fair election in 2024. But then Maduro held a referendum to claim part of neighboring Guyana, a decades-old dispute. This scared people. Was he planning an invasion to grab Guyana's offshore oil? Exxon runs those fields, and they're critical for Western energy. The referendum also helped Maduro sideline opposition candidates. Biden, frustrated, reimposed sanctions in April 2024. The July 2024 election brought even more chaos. Maduro and opposition candidate Edmundo Gonzalez both claimed victory, but Maduro refused to give out the vote counts. The opposition showed poll results proving a landslide win for Gonzalez. The US and Europe refused to recognize the results, declared Gonzalez the legitimate president, while Russia, China, and others stuck with Maduro. Protests were crushed, over 2,000 arrested, dozens killed. Gonzalez fled to Spain. Maduro had cemented himself as a dictator. Venezuela's corruption ranking tanked, dropping behind even Syria, Eritrea, and North Korea. Trump's sanctions didn't push Maduro out, and Biden's attempts at diplomacy fell flat too. American influence faded, while Russia, China, and Iran started making deeper inroads. Near the end of his presidency, Biden even jacked up the price on Maduro's head to $25 million. Then the second Trump administration kicked off, and the strategy changed again. At first, Trump went back to hardline pressure. He pulled Chevron's licenses, but pushback inside the administration forced him to reconsider. Eventually, he sent Richard Grenell to talk directly with Maduro. They brokered a deal. Lightened some sanctions if Maduro freed American hostages and took back deported Venezuelans. Just in July, 9 deportation flights landed in Venezuela. Clearly, the cooperation was happening on a much closer level than before. But Trump also understood the old playbooks. Sanctions and soft engagement had gotten nowhere. Plus, talking with Maduro would have infuriated his own supporters, including Cuban Americans and his Secretary of State, Marco Rubio. He wanted something new, and ended up turning to gunboat diplomacy. Taking out Maduro checks a lot of boxes for the U.S. It cuts off the drug pipeline, removes a threat to Guyana's oil fields, gets Western oil companies back into Venezuela, bumps up global oil supply to squeeze Russia, and knocks out an emerging base for U.S. rivals. Russia's been talking about building a huge ammo factory there, and they've already sold billions in weapons. Iran's deepened military ties too. Venezuela rolled out a kamikaze drone modeled after Iran's Shahed 136, the same drones Russia's used against Ukraine. Sure, right now they're not sophisticated, but with help, they could threaten targets as far away as Florida or even the Panama Canal. That's not something Washington is willing to risk. Still, the U.S. doesn't have the boots on the ground for a major invasion. Just 4,500 troops offshore, compared to the 30,000 sent to Panama in 1989. Instead, Trump looks like he's gambling that the reward on Maduro and the military presence will tempt insiders to flip, hoping for U.S. air support, sort of like NATO backing the Libyan rebels against Gaddafi. The U.S. already has Edmundo Gonzalez waiting in the wings as a replacement. Tomahawk missiles and F-35s put airstrikes on the table. Marines could move in for a fast, targeted raid to grab Maduro if chaos breaks out. This kind of limited, surgical strike fits Trump's style. He did missile strikes in Syria, took out the ISIS leader with special forces, and ordered a drone to kill Iran's top commander. And in 2025, he's already hit the Houthis in Yemen and called in a B-2 bombing run on Iranian nuclear sites. Venezuela's military? Honestly, it's not all that intimidating. Their navy embarrassed itself in 2020 by sinking its own patrol boat after hitting a cruise ship. Sanctions have crippled their gear. No parts or repairs for aging Russian equipment. Even their S-300 air defense system would struggle if F-35s or Tomahawks come knocking. If Trump gives the order, Maduro can't do much to stop what's coming. But will bombs really topple Maduro? Tough to say. Sometimes outside attacks make regimes dig in deeper, Just look at Iran. And if the government falls, then what? You could get chaos, like Libya or Iraq, with non-state fighters in Colombia grabbing any opening they see. Right before this video went live, Venezuela accused the U.S. of tripling intelligence flights and said a U.S. warship boarded a Venezuelan fishing boat, the first sign of escalating pressure. If this breakdown helped you make sense of the crisis, or just gave you a clearer way to talk about it, go ahead, like the video, subscribe to SmartScope, and share it with someone who should hear it. Honestly, grappling with these forces, no matter how tense or dangerous, is the only way to steer through them. The U.S.-Venezuela standoff shows how history, oil, and power politics can drag countries to the edge, and sometimes the only thing you can count on is that nothing stays certain for long. Thanks for watching. See you next time.